everyone, and welcome to the historic Lanphear Livery and the Conservancy's beautiful community gathering space, the Chaplain B. Barnes Reading Room. My name is Barbara Axmacher, and I am the Executive Director here at the Conservancy. Before we begin tonight's special presentation, I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge our 2024 community programming sponsors. This year, 17 generous businesses and families agreed to sponsor our work, with their support helping to defray the cost of our reading room public programming, general educational programming, as well as the care and maintenance of this meeting space. Please join me in thanking these sponsors. Additionally, I would also like to acknowledge the efforts of our staff, Daniel Cole, Becky Wilson, Tommy Papadia, and Chris Polinsky. Their assistance is critical to the success of tonight's Lanphear Live presentation. Finally, I invite you to join us on August 19th at 6 p.m., right here in the reading room, as our Lanphear Live series continues with the underwater archaeology and the shipwrecks of Rhode Island, with archaeologist Charlotte C.W. Taylor of the Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission. With Rhode Island having more shipwrecks per square mile than any other state in the country, it should prove to be a fascinating presentation. And now, please welcome Conservancy President and Chief Science Advisor, Dr. Peter August.
Thank you, Barbara. The shipwrecks has nothing to do with our maritime skills. It's a dangerous place to be on the water. Let's get that squared away right now. The United States Naval War College in Newport was established in 1884. Its mission is to train senior officers of the U.S. Navy and other branches of the military in leadership, strategic naval warfare, decision-making, and maritime operations. In 1887, the same year that the Lanphear Livery, this building was built, the War College held its very first wargaming exercise. Nearly all of the naval operations of the 20th century were designed and gamed at the War College. You'll recognize many of the alumni of the program. Astronaut Alan Shepard, the fifth man on the moon. Carlos Del Toro, the current Secretary of the Navy. James Stavridis, Commander-in-Chief of the Joint NATO Forces, and somebody who is on TV a lot these days, helping us understand what's happening in that part of the world. Mark Milley, the recent Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Our speaker tonight is retired Army Lieutenant Colonel John Scott Logel, a senior faculty member of the Naval War College in Newport. Dr. Logel has held faculty appointments at the United States Military Academy at West Point and Salve Regina University. He is a full professor in the Wargaming Department and the Center for Naval Warfare Studies, and his academic focus is the design and implementation of gaming scenarios to identify solutions to challenges in naval operations. Professor Logel received his doctoral and master's degrees in history from Syracuse University and an undergraduate degree in political science from Wake Forest University. So he's seeing wargaming through the eyes of a historian. He's published numerous technical papers and reports on wargaming and authored a widely acclaimed book on the role of West Point engineers in the development of New York City in the 19th century. Tonight, Dr. Logel will discuss the history of the wargaming program at the War College and how it is used in training the country's military leadership. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Scott Logel.
Thank you for the generous introduction, and thank you for hosting me tonight. I'd like to acknowledge a couple of special guests in the room, my wife, Peg, and then an old friend, an old boss, and current colleague, Dr. Thomas Gibbons and his wife, Anna. And then I'd like to acknowledge Dr. John Hanley. He's just visiting tonight, but he's also part of this story that I'm going to tell you about 137 years of wargaming here at Newport. As a show of hands, who in here has played Battleship? All right. When I talk about wargaming, I want you to think about Battleship, right? You have to figure out, first you set up your forces, you have the opponent on the other side, and your goal is to find and sink as many of their ships before they sink yours, right? That's the most basic form of the wargaming. So everything that I'm going to tell you about tonight is an extrapolation from that simple game dynamic. And I want you to think about it that way. So I'm going to talk about some key individuals that played a role in this over the last 137 years. I'm going to try to do it in 6 parts. First, we'll talk about what is a war game, why does the Navy do it, why did it do it, why does it do it still. We'll look at the beginnings from 1884 all the way through the start of World War I. And then I'm going to talk about the first golden age of wargaming, the interwar period, the 1920s and 1930s. Perhaps the most familiar period that you all would know if you studied wargaming and thinking about the Navy in World War II. Then I'm going to talk about the advent of computers. And that has relevancy to us today as we think about all the AI and computer technology that's out there and how do we use that to improve our war games. And then I'm going to finish with the second golden age. That's Dr. Hanley's age of when we did the global war games to look at the maritime strategy and how to defeat the Soviet Navy. And then we'll finish with some observations about where we are today, thinking about wargaming from 2001 on. So what is a war game? This is the definition that we use at the college, we use in the wargaming department. And you have to have these components for it to be a war game, right? It's a simulation of selected aspects of a conflict situation, right? So you don't do the whole war, you pick out the parts of the war that you want to investigate, right? And you do it in accordance with predetermined set of rules, data, and procedures. Again, Battleship, right? The rules are right there. The procedures are you take your turn, and the data is as you use your pegs in the enemy's ships. We call those pucks. But those rules and data are important because you're going to follow that for structure, and you're going to go through those rules and those procedures to gain the experience of trying to understand how to do what you're trying to accomplish in the game, and you're going to gain information. You're going to gain knowledge. It's going to provide decision-making information. And you do that in a war game at Newport because it has to be applicable to a real-world situation, right? How does this help the Navy? How does this help the security of the nation? And that definition is from Frank McHugh. They published it in 1966. Frank McHugh served as a war gamer from the 1930s through the 1970s. And so really he's one of the key continuities that take the heart of this story all the way through the 2 golden ages at least. Experience and information are not exclusive. Some people will say, oh, I'm just going to war game for fun, war game to learn, right? And some people say, oh, we're just going to war game to research how we can use sharks with lasers to defeat any adversary in the world. The reality is you cannot have a war game that just gives you analytic data without thinking about the experience of the players that are going to be in it. And so they're interrelated, and you'll see that in this story. And you have to have decisions. You have to have decisions with consequences. If the players go through this process, they turn in their moves, and then they go to the next discussion, that's what we call a bog sat, a bunch of guys sitting around a room, sitting around a table. That's not a war game per se. Right? So what is a war game good for? So war games will organize the what by going through the process of understanding the data in front of you, understanding how your game piece will perform. It helps you understand how this can work as opposed to just reading about it on the page, right? You can see the events unfold on your eyes, right? You can see the interrelationship. It'll help you explore what you didn't know, right? You just assume that if I've got a shark with laser, it is going to be successful every time in annihilating whatever the laser is going to shoot. Right? But what you don't know in that scenario is what can affect the shark. And you may learn that in the process of wargaming with a boat that has that special capability. There's important caveats to a war game. Right? A war game will never validate or prove a concept. Right? That's important to remember. When you see somebody get on the press or you read in the media online, this war game proved that we will be successful. This war game proved that we cannot win. That is not an absolute, and you need to understand that. But what a war game is good for is help you understand your assumptions. It helps you understand where you may have risk, where you may have vulnerabilities. It may show you ways to be successful. Right? So when you think about a war game, and we talk about the history of wargaming, the context of every game matters. Why was the game being played? What was the purpose? Was this game to educate surface warfare officers how to navigate their destroyers? Or was this game designed to understand how Fifth Fleet is going to stop Houthis from attacking ships in the Red Sea? Right? So you have to understand why the game's being played. You have to understand how they played the game. Were there rule sets? Was there a lot of discussion? How much time was allotted for each move? Right? And each of those decisions that are made for a game are built for those specific purposes. And most importantly, who played the game? Were they students? Were they experts? In our games, often we have the finest military officers who are actually in those leadership positions come play themselves in the games. So the insights they gain are much more valuable for our reporting and for decision makers in DC and beyond, because ideally those are the best players you can get. But if you've got a bunch of students coming from an ROTC unit coming to play the game, the findings and what they tell you may not be as interesting, but they may learn a lot, and that may be why you have those players play that game. So think about why they're playing the game, what's the purpose of it, what were the rules, and who were the players. So at the beginning of this year, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, Chief of Naval Operations, CNO, was talking to the Surface Naval Association down in DC, and she sort of gives me the outline for tonight, right? This is how the senior leader, the most senior officer in the Navy thinks about wargaming, right? And she looks at the 1930s and the 1970s as being appropriate, where there could be historical lessons drawn for thinking about how to build the fleet for tomorrow, right? And what she thinks about, and what she hits on there with the wargaming enterprise here at the War College, is we are teaching them how to operate in uncertain, complex, and rapidly changing environments. War games are suited to help you with the unknown, to help you prepare to meet those challenges and anticipate things in a safe space so you don't have to experience them in real life. The goal tonight is to provide you guys a glimpse into the insights of the enduring value of wargaming, and hopefully you'll see some of that as we go through our age. So off to the beginning part. Here's Founders Hall out there on Costa Harbors Island in the middle of Narragansett Bay. It was the poorhouse. If you come across the bridge, it's the Naval War College Museum today. Stephen Luce established the War College there. It was north of Goat Island. Goat Island is where, I don't know who owns the hotel now, but it used to be Gurney's, used to be a Sheridan a long time ago. But that was the torpedo station, and that had been there since the Civil War. And so the torpedo station was the central focus of the Navy in Newport. So Luce is going off against the grain, against the conventional wisdom when he says we need a war college. Right? And he's listening to the other military leaders of professional military education of the age, specifically Emory Upton from the Army. He says we need a school to train military officers to think about operational strategic warfare. And we in the Navy have to do that here. And we're going to do it at this little island north of the torpedo station. So Stephen B. Luce is a reformer, right? So he procures the poorhouse, and from 1884 to about 1892, there are a lot of folks in the Department of the Navy who are trying to kill the War College, right? One of the two probably most important moves that Admiral Luce did is he hired Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan to be an instructor. Mahan does his lectures on sea power, and Secretary of the Navy is coming up in 1896 to close the War College, and he reads Mahan's book that's published, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and he says this book alone is worth saving the War College. So it was very tenuous in those early years. The other thing that Luce does is Admiral Luce understands wargaming. We called Captain McCarty Little the father of wargaming at the college. That's why the Wargaming Center is named after, the building that houses the Wargaming Center is named after McCarty Little. But Stephen B. Luce, founder of the college, also believed in wargaming. And he understood that the games highlight what you don't want to do, right? And you can eliminate wrong moves or pathways to failure, as he says there, right? The number of don'ts, tactics may be eliminated, right? Which will leave the gamer with safe and probably approved methods to success. But he needed a cadre to execute this. And part of his plan, his curriculum for the college was to have lectures, have the students read, not very structured, but he wanted them to read as much as they could, and he wanted them to wargame. So we get William McCarty Little. Lieutenant William McCarty Little volunteered to work for the college after he had been retired from the Navy in 1884. He and Luce had similar views of naval warfare and war as a science. If you look at their readings in the archives, they're very similar in their views of philosophy and thinking about how to make war a discipline. McCarty Little is an 1866 graduate of the Naval Academy. He served on various flagships. 1876, he goes has a gun accident that basically makes his one eye unable to see. For 8 years, he tries to stay in the Navy, and then the eye doctor says, "You're out." Well, Luce knew that McCarty Little was there. He liked McCarty Little's way to think. In 1885, McCarty Little starts lecturing on war games. And really what he's talking about is how war games will develop the habit of mind, right? And in his chart maneuver book, right, he calls war games chart maneuvers because it's war on the map. In 1912 is when this came out. He says the art may be regarded as a product of three factors: the right thing, rightly applied in time, right? So the goal of any war game is to have participants, the officers, understand how to use their force, how to do it correctly, and to have it there at the right moment, and to make it a habit of mind. It's practiced, right? It's Bill Belichick working out the Patriots every season, trying to get them to do right. So this is what McCarty Little's thinking about. They did start wargaming in Founders Hall. By 1892, 1893, we have Luce Hall. That's the large granite building you see when you come across the bridge. And here we have, on the game floor, international officers gaming on the table. I could show you any variety of pictures we've got from that time period, but notice they're all studying the table. You've got the move sheets. Here as they're going on this side for their plan. Here you have an adjudicator who is moving the pucks on the map as it's been figured out. And the idea is to scale up from ship on ship to battle group versus battle group to fleet on fleet. And McCarty Little understands that it's using the German game Kriegspiel and adapting that to naval warfare that is going to educate these officers to think about how they can fight their ships. And it was also a cheap way to do that, right? It's cheaper to do it on a table with a bunch of metal pieces than it is to put a bunch of ships into Narragansett Bay and figure out how you're going to do maneuvers. The rule sets are important, and I'm stealing liberally from my colleague Peter Pellegrino, so I gave him a little copy right there. There are three basic time frames that we can group the rule sets in. From the time of McCarty Little through the end of World War I, it was McCarty Little's game board. It was the chart maneuver. Relatively simple. You could also export it, put it in a box, put it in the wardroom, and while you're underway, you can have your officers do quick duel games. You could have them do battle group versus battle group, strategic surface action group versus surface action group, to use an anachronistic term there. Very gunnery deterministic, right? This is the age of battleships. From 1880s through World War I, we get the advent of the steel ships and coal-powered ships, and gunnery is not completely understood. And depending on the range and caliber and the testing of guns, that data would come into the college and they become part of the rules. Going into 1920s, we have the World War I experience, specifically the Battle of Jutland, which I'll talk about here in a moment. And the adjudication becomes the primary time use. And it takes a long time. And they want to understand the detail about how each engagement may go as they build up. And so they come up with gun tables, quick lookup tables, the same way, remember you used to look up how long it would take to get from Providence to Boston on your Rand McNally? That's how a gun table would work. And picture that for all the different types of guns they would have. And post-World War II, as with many other fields in the defense industry and in industry writ large, it was how do we use these computers? How do we use computing? And how do we find ways to go quicker with the computation? I'm going to talk about the Naval Electronic Warfare Simulator. That's what NEWS is. And that is the first effort to computerize adjudication in games here at Newport. But there still are manual games that will happen. Again, not predictable adjudication, but probable. The probability has to make sense to the players. It has to be believable. It can't be just something that was made up. The purpose of adjudication, when we think about it, is to get the players into an environment to make the next decision in the game. So adjudication means another decision for the players when it returns to them. And this is something that McCarty Little understood from the beginning. After World War I, Admiral Sims, who was president in 1917, gets sent over to London, takes over becomes a senior naval commander for the U.S. forces during that war. He returns, and they put him back as president of the Naval War College in 1919. And he establishes the interwar course and curriculum in detail of which books they're going to read and how the games are going to go. And he is an advocate for the value of wargaming. This is from his lecture in 1912. He understood this even before he took command. But what he understands is that this is the same as a football team. You have to practice, and that's what a war game will do for officers. And then he says, in absence of experience, real-world experience, wargaming experience is the next best thing. If I can figure it out in a war game, experience in a war game, it's real enough for me to do that. So what was the game that they played during the interwar period? Well, it's Jutland. Who's familiar with the Battle of Jutland in 1916? It was the German high seas fleet tries to escape out to the North Sea. Beatty and Jellicoe take the Royal Navy, and they intercept it. Depending on who you read, it's about a draw, but it makes the German high seas fleet never escapes again, and it turns into a U-boat campaign to oversimplify what happens there. But this happens in May 31st, June 1st of 1916, right? This is the first major battleship melee that the modern world, the modern navies have seen. And November, the Naval War College officers are refighting this battle on the floors of Lewes Hall. And you see this blue schematic. A lot of the archives from the interwar period will have this blueprint paper, and this is how they would do their charts. This is before any type of computer-aided drawings. It was how can you draw the maritime terrain, how can you show where the forces are, and how can you fight it? Well, the guy that did this, that came up with the Jutland game, is this guy, Lieutenant Holloway Frost. And he was a bright, shiny, strategic star in the Navy as a lieutenant. He's a Lieutenant JG. He's in the course. And he's taken the course that Professor Mahan is teaching. Here's his book. This is a book that saved the War College, published by Little Brown, still read by our students today. And Frost does this, and he spends the next 20 years perfecting this game, right? Russell Wegley, the military historian, writes about Frost, and he says Frost should have been the next Alfred Thayer Mahan. He was he wrote in Washington Post numerous articles. He wrote articles in the Naval Institute Press Proceedings. And what happened is he ends up going out to Leavenworth, and he dies at the Army base teaching out there. So in 1935, he passes away. He would have been in the same generation as these admirals and leaders of World War II had he lived. Right? So it's a big what if, but there is a lot of truth to what Professor Wegley was arguing when he said that Frost really was a naval genius. In the Battle of Jutland treatment, he knew how to take the sources of data, right? So he took English records, German records. We were also getting inside information from Sims and his staff, and they were using that to recreate the battle. And it wasn't just to reenact Jutland, but it was to come up with alternatives. Frost urges the American naval officers playing this game to be offensive-minded. Don't be too timid. Be bold with your maneuver. Be bold with your fires. And he was very similar to Admiral Sims. They both had the idea, and you've probably heard a turn of this phrase before describing General Grant, perhaps. You know, it's the idea of thinking about what can we do to the enemy rather than what the enemy can do to us, right? How do I carry the fight to them? So it's a very offensive-minded spirit. The other document I would like to highlight is this pamphlet. Frost writes Naval Doctrine, and he wrote this pamphlet in 1920 with Admiral Yarnell and Admiral Pye, and it's the conduct of an overseas naval campaign, right? And it's the first blueprint or concept of how to fight across the Pacific. This is from War Plan Orange, right? The idea of island hopping. How are you going to carry American naval power to curtail and defeat an enemy across a large expanse of water? And he's thinking about this in a very thoughtful way. He's thinking about it with what will it take to get beyond just refueling a ship and rearming a ship, right? In this 1925 article, he drafts an article on national strategy, right? And this is 1925. This is D-Day, 1944, after D-Day, right? He's projecting 20 years, 19 years in advance what it's going to take to win a major war, right? And it's not just the naval force, but it's going to be the whole economy, right? And it's going to be a large amount of money that's going to have to be expended. So he's echoing what many of the planners are thinking about is in the early 20s, and really comes to fruition in the Rainbow plans that are developed in the 30s, right? Is everybody familiar with the Rainbow plans? The planners, the Army and the Navy planners and the planning board in D.C. basically came up with contingency plans, and they put a color to each country. Britain was red, Germany was black, and Japan was orange. So you've heard War Plan Orange. So the idea of getting after orange is going to loom large because Japan is something for them to think about. So how does the War College think about and get after the prospect of trying to fight an enemy navy, specifically the Japanese Navy? Right? Here it is, Pringle Hall. They did it on the gaming floor. If you go to the college, our international programs is based in this very hall right now. If they tore the carpet up, you could probably see some of this old tile. What you've got are this is the board, right? You've got the measuring sticks. You've got the positions of where the fleets are going to be, right? Intel behind the curtains. when it came time for aerial reconnaissance, they would send the players up to the balcony to look around, right? And they would submit their moves in, and they would figure out how to play this game, right? Now, let's go back and remember what a war game is, right? This is from Peter Perla. Peter Perla was of the age of Dr. Hanley, right? When you come to the wargaming department, the first book they hand you is The Art of Wargaming by Peter Perla. He passed away this past February. Many of us lament the fact that we no longer get to have conversations with Peter. But he is one of the great influences that take us to today. And the way he thinks about it, again, is decisions made by the players, right? He understands that decisions have to be made. So decisions in this era are going with incomplete and imperfect information. So by the 1920s, late 1920s, 1930s, they understand that we've got to come up with ways to make players simulate not knowing, simulate that fog of war, simulate the friction that happens with not knowing. Right? So what did they do during the interwar period? If you read Mike Vlahos's book, The Blue Sword, they played 318 games, right, over this 20-year period. So the classes would go through. This is the number of games they would play. The dark blue are tactical and quick decision games of the darker blue. We've got strategic games in the light blue. And then we've got some operational games here that are big, that emerge as you go along. And so the games they played in 1920 are not the same games they played throughout, right? So when we think about repetition, and what was Admiral Nimitz meaning when he said we learned everything we needed to learn during the interwar period? Nimitz is at the college in 1923. Admiral Halsey is here in 36. 33 is Admiral King, right? They're not seeing the same games. That would be like saying that a game that our players played today in 2024 is the same as they played in 2004. Not necessarily the case. But the games are informational and experiential because players are learning how to think about strategy to get across the Pacific, right? They're thinking about how am I going to defend the Atlantic and the Caribbean sea line, and then what tactics are you going to use, right? How are we going to put the ships in line? How are we going to use torpedoes as torpedo technology improves? How are we going to employ aircraft? How are we going to use scouting? All of these ideas are new and novel in the 20s and 30s and have to be figured out on that game board, right? The other thing that I would highlight, last thing to remember on here is, after World War I, we had the Treaty Navy, right? They had the Washington Naval Treaty, which was going to limit the number of battleships, right? No more wars. So the problem set, the number of game pieces that the players would get would be equivalent to what they would have according to the Treaty Navy, to the treaty limitation. So they didn't have an unlimited number of ships. They didn't have an unlimited number of aircraft carriers. They had to make sure that the game's pieces reflected what they would have available according to the limits of the treaty. And of course, this is probably the most storied line of folks who came through the college. Admiral King, Admiral Stark, Admiral Nimitz, Admiral Halsey, and of course Admiral Spruance. Fortunately, I don't have enough time to go into each of their histories, but when you think about who are the great naval leaders of our country, they all came through the War College during this first golden age. They all wargamed. They all wrote papers. They all went through these 318 games in different shapes or forms. So in 1923, Commander Nimitz had to think about the game. So remember I said there was reading, there were lectures, right? And there was wargaming. Admiral Sims added writing, right? So here is a joint military operations paper. We call it JMO for the students for the last 40 years. And what this officer, Chester Nimitz, was thinking about in 1923 is how do we get a base of operations to extend from Oahu in Hawaii to Japan to fight the fleet, right? He's thinking about this almost 20 years before he has to do it, right? As a student, and he's writing about it. Now, a lot of what they wrote was not original. It was reflecting the instruction and what the lectures were telling them. And the college was also part of the Navy's first iteration of what we would call a research cycle, right? And as you look at the slide, these are books that I would recommend if you're interested in this era. War Plan Orange by Ed Miller. Al Nafi's got To Train the Fleet Problems. This is a free download book you can get from Naval Heritage History Command. Norm Friedman's Winning a Future War. He'll write about, you can learn about all 318 of the war games played in that volume. Mike Vlahos has a good bibliography and a catalog of the games that were played. This is also available online from the War College website. And John Kuhn writes about the innovation here. Now, what are these books telling us? Well, from the college, the game reports, they started running reports in 1933, get sent to OPNAV, to the planning division, right? And they would come back and give guidance back down to the college. Put this in your next war game. We want you to think about how to use balloons. We want you to think about how you're going to use aircraft. What are you going to do with these patrol aircraft? What are you going to do with submarines? It comes into the game. And then they would send fleet problem suggestions out to the fleet. Every time the fleet sortied from 1919 to 1941, there would be some sort of scenario they would fight. They could fight down to Panama, they could fight out to Hawaii, they could fight their way back from Hawaii. And what they needed to do is have umpires. Umpires were basically War College staff that would go out and observe. These were the same staff people that were coming back and running the war games for the students. The graduates, right? I showed you 5 of the ones we like to brag about. They would go to other installations, other training commands, and it becomes this cycle of ideas, right? The enterprise, OPNAV, the War College, the bureaus, the general board. The general board's coming up with the plans to think about how to fight this future war, right? So there's a lot of intellectual energy going here. So let's talk about war games being used for analysis. This is the first case I could find in the college when they said, the Navy said, I want to know what you learned in your war games and put it in a report. This guy, Captain Wilbur Van Auken, gets assigned to the college in 32, and Admiral Lanning says, write this report, get it up there, because they were getting ready for a meeting, some decisions about the Treaty Navy. And so he writes this long memo, gets sent up to OPNAV, but the key part about this was he was told to do an analysis of all the blue-orange games. Right? So they tried to figure out what games had in common. So they went to the operational game, and they realized since 1927, 1928, 29, 30, 31, 32, there was a blue-orange game that they played at the operational level. So again, they would lay out, there's a table. It's just a giant spreadsheet today, right? You would do it on Excel. But they list out the order of battle and the ships, and they list out where they went and what the battle damage was, right? So not very exciting, but what is useful to think about is it's certainly related to that doctrine I just showed you, right? The Trans-Pacific problem, right? And you get a sense of what they were tabulating in their spreadsheet, right? What were the losses prior to the tactical phase, right? Here's the losses to the orange, right? Here was the orange force, this is what they had. And they've got some sort of record you can go through and you can analyze that. The other thing I would like to highlight on here for what was undamaged for the blue, right? How did our battleships do? How did our cruisers do? How did our destroyers do? And where did they go geographically? So in each of these problems, these names are all from Pacific Islands, right? So the leaders are getting familiar with the terrain of the Pacific, right? So they're learning and experiencing how to fight this war. So when Nimitz says we experienced pretty much everything about the war, he's talking about every one of these officers going through a blue-orange problem set. How do I sustain it? How do I fight it? How do I direct it? How do I organize the ships for battle? What did it mean for analysis? Well, in the Van Auken report, this is just an excerpt, right? Thinking about the balanced treaty navy, right? They're thinking about what speed could they have gone at, right? And can you maintain a 15-knot formation speed, right? That was the insight from the game. They sent that back out to the fleet. Can you get a formation at 15 knots, right? So it's a big, it's part of that cycle. And it's part of the innovation that is going on during the war that helps us through the war. So I'm going to stop there. That's the end of the first golden age. We go through World War II. Lots of high fives, right? We are victorious, right? This is the greatest generation. But the leaders come back to Newport and they say, what didn't we get right? Well, a lot of concern about logistics and sustainment. We didn't have the fuel right. We didn't have the deep depots right. What if we couldn't have that whole sea base out in the Western Pacific? What do we do about that? And Henry Eccles comes in and he makes the play for we need a bigger gaming space. We moved to Sims Hall. This floor still exists over in the east wing of Sims Hall. You can see this floor. So this is obviously a stage photo, but looking at how they could think about refight, do some of the maneuvers, how do you sustain it? How do you get after that? The other thing to come in the war is, as I mentioned, highlighted earlier, is the advent of computers, right? The Naval Electronic Warfare Simulator, right? And this is a flow chart of where the functions would happen, right? The inputs and factors that come to the commander, and it ends up going back in through the process. They have the interactions. There's a command decision in the middle, professional judgment, right? And they use the factor modifications in the computer, right? And the damaged computer is going to keep track of that spreadsheet. The damaged computer is going to tell you how you're doing, right? Sounds pretty cool. Sounds like, why do we need a computer? Well, news came from the Navy Electronic Lab in San Diego. Why did we want a computer? During the war, Admiral Nimitz put this command out. It's a small one. That he said every ship that fights in the Pacific Fleet will have a tactical command. It will have a commander. Will have a command information center, the CIC. Because in modern warfare during World War II, no longer did a ship just have to rely on the watch. They now had to rely on the radio, and they had to rely on ASDIC, radar, right? So now you have all sorts of tactical information coming on, and you cannot manage that necessarily from the bridge. So they recommend, and Admiral Nimitz puts this out to all the fleet, we will have a CIC, a Command Information Center, that will work with the bridge so the commander can make his decisions to integrate all that information. So they build a simulator, a CIC simulator. And Frank McHugh, 34 to 74, is charged with putting this together. They start in 1945 putting together the wargaming computer for news. It doesn't operate until November 1958. 13 years later it took to make this thing work, right? So you hear about trying to get AI into gaming or into your technology now. Don't be in a rush, because I would submit that the friction they served had 80 years ago is similar to frictions that technology has interfacing with real-world problems today. In this description and proceedings, what I like about this quote is McHugh gives us the reason for the computer, right? Commanders may exercise their professional judgment in the employment of assigned forces during the game. Professional judgment. They have to make a decision, right? The computer's not going to decide for them. A person still has to do it, right? What does this computer look like? This is the building. This is Sims, right? It's kind of cool, huh? Right? Dr. Handler remembers this probably from back in the day. So it had all these projectors up here that projected onto the front screen, right? They had a balcony above so people could observe. But upstairs on the third deck, they had 22 CIC simulators, metal boxes with a radio, a map board, and that's when you see the pictures of the gaming. They have there the sailors with an officer. They're simulating inside a ship, a frigate or a destroyer, right? It was extrapolated into larger, more operational type levels of gaming, right? And they had the big board. I'm going to date myself, Generation X, the Matthew Broderick War Games. Remember the movie from 1983, right? Yeah, the Whopper, right? Here's your first version of the Whopper, putting it up on the screen. It looks pretty high tech, but here's the types of forces and pucks, right? It's a tabulation up on a big board, right? You've got sailors keeping track of positions on their side maps. But the adjudicator's in the middle, right? I think they got Chump. I'd like to know who Chump is. He must be in the middle there. The they're still using maps. They're still backing it up with paper, right? But it certainly looks pretty fancy. There's a picture in some of the archives. In the late 1960s, international officers are being shown the wargaming computer. Today, people come to visit and they'll say, "Where is the computer?" They want to see the computer. They want to see this thing. I think, I don't know. We have to figure out what we can show them. But there is no computer like that. So I'm going to defer to Peter Perla. Here's the evolution of the wargaming computer in this second in the computer age, right? Talks about 1958, right? It only had 4 speeds. It requires an entire department to support. Wargaming department guy here. Department starts in 1958 when the computer's ready to go. We didn't have a wargaming department per se for that. It evolves into the 70s to this warfare analysis and research system, right? And it becomes kind of a bookkeeping tool, right? They realize that you can't really integrate and have automation happen. And then it becomes NWIGS, the Naval Warfare Gaming System. Dr. Hanley, this is probably the system you're familiar with, right? And it assumed perfect communications. It had faults with it that still were not quite right. What Peter Perla talks about, the fact that it was an abysmal game in poor simulation naval warfare, he spoke to us in 2015, and he was talking about the idea of having a computer that could actually overcome these frictions. I call it the holy grail of wargaming. If you find a computer that can assimilate and process all that information and give you insights into how the adversary is thinking, that's not a computer. You need people to do that. So limits to computers, it does help with computation. It does help give adjudication results of interactions and scores back quickly. Now on to the second golden age, the maritime strategy. When you see this slide, this is 1984. I want you to think Reagan's Navy, Reagan's military, right? We're coming out of the Vietnam War, right? All the services are trying to search for relevance. The Soviets are presenting a new threat, right? We have got the increase of nuclear weapons, and the Navy is trying to figure out how can they carry the fight to the Soviets, how can it become more offensive-minded, right? And so Commander Spencer Johnson and Commander Stan Weeks basically write the first version of this on 20-page legal pad, going around the Pentagon, and they'll tell you the story. You can go online. I can show you the websites, and if you meet Stan, he's lovely. It was just these two commanders, and they wrote it. And then who takes hold of it? Well, first, what it says is we're going to defend the flanks, right? We have to retain those SLOCs, right? Sea lines of communication, the Panama Canal, Straits of Gibraltar, Suez Canal, all those places as choke points. The Straits of Malacca, right here in Taiwan, in Singapore. You've got to make sure that those are secure so the Navy can project power and contain the Soviet threat from being able to reinforce Europe and attack the United States. So beginning in 1979, we have the first global game. And it's Admiral Hayward's generation. It comes out of the experience of Atlantic Fleet officers who had come in the 70s. And they realized there was an operational value to having the officers figure out how can we make a plan against the Soviet Navy, right? And so from Global 79 to Global 84, it was a brand new game every year. By Global 82, Global 83, Secretary of the Navy John Lehman sees what's going on with this game and understands the value that not only is it helping naval officers prepare and the joint force prepare for war, but it's also going to help show congressmen and media members the value of the 600-ship Navy. Why do we need to have this force that we need? Right? So it becomes a bit of a salesman show. So if you go to the archives, you can start reading the list of dignitaries. You can see Senator John Warner come. You can see Newt Gingrich as a guest. So it really is a 3-week extravaganza. And I have to tell you that everything I understand about the Global War Games comes from talking to people like John Hanley, who was there. So after we get done, you can ask him what I've missed here. But in the second part, as we got through Global 85, into Global 85, they decided to do a campaign, and they did it sequentially, right? Ultimately, what the planners and writers of the Global War Games decided or figured out was that they said this helped the strategy figure out that the war is going to be, could be non-nuclear, right? It realized that if it's a protracted war, you're going to have to figure out how to roll back gains made by the Soviets in Europe, right? You're going to have sea control, but it's going to be hard to maintain. And you have to figure out how you're going to end this war. What were the levers for war termination? Where could you get the Soviets to say no mas? And that sea control was the key to the U.S. economy, right? All from this game that would have anywhere between 300 and 400, 600 people for 3 weeks in Newport from 79 through 88. It continued on into the 90s. But with the end of the Cold War, it kind of lost its focus, right? Went futuristic. And as did many of the other services, trying to figure out what are we going to do for our defense budgets, right? What does the peace dividend mean, and so forth. The other sea story I'll share on this, Ben Griffiths wrote a book about Tom Clancy in literature. And I had a conversation with John Hanley years ago where you said you swear the 1984 game report ended up into Red Storm Rising, the scenario for that. And there may be some truth to that, but when you go and look at what Larry Bond did and Tom Clancy, at the same time, right after 1984, a group of guys got together 2 times in the spring of 85 and played this scenario. It's called Dance of the Vampires, using the Harpoon war game. And Tom Clancy wanted to understand what would be the interaction of the forces so he could write his novel. So if you read Red Storm Rising and you pay attention to the naval battles that Tom Clancy describes in there, they're very similar to the dynamic that the players were trying to understand in the global war games, certainly in 83, 84, 85. So it's a little bit of cultural history that's tied there. Oh, and there's John Lehman. This picture hung in Dave Brower's office. See, Dave Brower has been at the War College for 40 years. And I always like it because these guys were the virtual training unit back in the 80s. So we were thinking about virtual training. And again, if you read any of John Lehman's memoirs, he does talk about the role of Newport. It's some of the details are a little fuzzy, but you get a good idea of how it went in the 1980s. And if you don't want to buy John Lehman's books, these books are also available online. You can get really this Newport Paper 20 is a good volume, and there's a lot of great documents that John Hattendorf and Peter Swartz put together in that era. As I get close to the end here, the final part, this picture was taken last year. They did another one. It's in the East Floor, right? There's Admiral Franchetti hamming it up with the 3 and 4 stars. And we always joke because we're talking about becoming more advanced and using computers, but what's in the middle of the game floor but a dice, right? But the key thing to think about for wargaming in the future and where we are now is these fundamentals are going to apply through all, right? You have to have the decision-making space. You have to think about McHugh's definition. And every game we design, every game we analyze, ask those questions. Do we have these elements in it? This is from Peter Perla, right? It's a cycle of research. I showed you that picture of the interwar period. Today, because we have so many organizations, DoD is so large, we have organizations, institutions that do analysis, like the Wargaming Department, and the Center for Naval Warfare Analysis writ large at the War College. We have exercises. That's done West Coast, East Coast. You pick your fleet concentration area. They will exercise. And we have to do war games. Not only do we do war games at Newport, but war games happen across the fleet at many locations and across the Joint Force. We have representatives from the Wargaming Department who will go to the Air Force War Games. We have representatives that go to the Army War Games and vice versa. And we have to think about what are the outcomes and how does that measure against the reality. Peter August asked me to mention just briefly, how do we think about cyber and how do we think about space? Since 2011, every war game we've done accounts for cyber. Whether it's a rule set, whether it's an assumption, whether we have actual cyber players, CNO, Admiral Roughhead said every game will account for some sort of cyber activity in the cyber domain. So we've done that. For space, when you think about space being a way to understand where the adversary is, where you are, how you communicate, we are really leveraging a lot of model and simulation computer technology to do that. Space is physics, so we don't need a subject matter expert to sit at a table and figure out where the satellites are going to go. We can use a simulation program to do that. And so when I think about the future of games, I can't predict anything, but I can tell you where players and where analysis shows that we have vulnerabilities are areas that we should probably think about more. That's from a research analytics side. From an educational side, as Dr. Gibbons can tell you, we have spent probably the last 10 years following Undersecretary of Defense Bob Work's memo and making sure that wargaming is a way to learn at the Naval War College. We put it in the international programs. We have it in our core programs. So you can, if you come to the War College, you will go through some sort of wargaming. It may be tabletop. It may be you passing messages through our computer program. It may be you doing it online from your house, from your desk. So the future for wargaming is bright because everyone learns so much from it. And it's hard to explain what did I get out of that war game. But when you put an admiral into the war game, and probably our greatest acolyte is Admiral Scott Swift. He did his first war game with us in 2009, and ever since then, if you hear Admiral Swift talk, he will tell you that wargaming was probably the most useful tool to help him think about command in his time. So with that, I'm going to finish and turn it over to the questions.